First of all, welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us. I am Joel Briere. I'm co-founder of the Five platform and founder of Cavalia Collective, which is a psychedelic wellness company focused on 5-MeO DMT.
I'm Victoria Wishner. I'm the Director of Education for Cavalia Collective, co-founder and president of Five. And also I work at Tandava Retreats as a head retreat lead. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Five yet, Five stands for 5-MeO DMT Information and Vital Education. And it's a centralized resource hub on all things 5-MeO DMT. And just to kind of give you guys a look, we're going to just share the screen. Joel, can you help me share the screen here?
I sure can.
Yeah, we've got a lot of great stuff that's offered on there as a resource. It's completely free to the public. And, you know, what you can do is you can head on to the website and you can find things like information, FAQs, integration specialists. We're teamed up with Fireside with safety principles. You can find all the risk cautions and contraindications, different ceremony resources if you're looking at sitting with this medicine and not quite sure what to look for. We've got a really extensive resource library with everything from scientific research to different documentaries, podcasts, essays, and of course, conservation stuff. And if you would like to rewatch this webinar, you can always just head to About Us under Five webinars, and the following Sunday we'll upload the webinar. And you know, if you have a friend or a loved one that hasn't been able to make it to the webinar, you can just go there as well. All right.
Let me close that.
Grab our notes up.
Okay, so firstly, let me introduce Dr. Bianca Sebben. Bianca is a clinical psychologist based in Australia with a special interest in complex PTSD, dissociative disorders, including dissociative identity disorder, and working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Her interest in psychedelics began when she completed her PhD in Indigenous psychology here in Mexico, where she became interested in traditional methods of healing, including plant medicines, and the need to create culturally safe and accessible services for Indigenous peoples. Bianca is a part of a working group that is currently developing a culturally safe model of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Bianca has a trauma-informed approach and works with modalities such as eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, sensorimotor and I can't see anything right now at this time of day. Sensorimotor and psychotherapy and structural disassociation. I can't wait to make a remix of that blooper and put some music behind it. Bianca supports clients to integrate their experiences with non-ordinary states of consciousness, including plant medicines and breath work, particularly those who have had a bad trip experience or emerging trauma themes. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for sharing your wisdom on trauma. It's an absolute honor to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about two of my favorite things to talk about, Five and trauma and dissociation. So I'm really looking forward to this. And firstly, I would like to acknowledge that today I'm joining you from Yagara country in Brisbane, Australia, which is the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples. And I want to acknowledge their deep and enduring connection to this country as the caretakers of this land for over 60,000 years. I'd also like to acknowledge the Lawika people of Morelos, where Joel and Victoria are joining us from today, and is the birthplace of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. So it's a very, very spiritual place. And I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the lands, which everybody joining us today is coming from, and the collective ancestry that brings us all here today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So again, thank you for having me. And
just real quick before we get started, for everyone watching, if you do have questions, you'll see there's a little Q&A area where you can enter in and submit your question. So anything you have to ask, any comments, anything like that, please feel free to throw it in there. Sorry, Bianca, go ahead.
Okay. And so, you know, today's talk is around safety considerations for working with 5-MeO. So I want to put it out there that these are considerations. I don't have all the answers. A lot of this hasn't been researched, but just with my understanding of both the Five experience and with trauma and dissociation, I do want to put it out there to consider some of these things that I'll bring up today, particularly for any facilitators out there that are working with this medicine and potentially people that may be presenting with dissociation that they might not be aware of. So, that question, is 5-MeO safe for trauma? I guess the short answer to that is maybe it depends. And so when we're talking about trauma, we want to recognize that there are different types of trauma as well. So we've got acute trauma, which is usually a single distressing event. So something like an accident or a sexual assault or a natural disaster. And then we have things like chronic trauma. So that's when someone is exposed to multiple long-term or prolonged distressing events over an extended period. So that can be things like childhood abuse or neglect, things like domestic violence, living with a long-term illness, living in poverty or a war zone, those kinds of things that are chronic and ongoing. And then we have complex trauma or attachment trauma. So that's when we're exposed to various types of traumatic experience, like a combination of both acute and chronic trauma. And there is a disruption to that early life attachment formation between the child and their primary caregivers. And this is the type of trauma where a more severe form, like a secondary or tertiary form of dissociation, may be present. Because we want to understand that dissociation is like a spectrum. All of us dissociate at the lower end of the spectrum. So daydreaming could be considered a dissociative state. So, but as we move up the spectrum of dissociation and we get that increase in fragmentation, right up this end, we have dissociative identity disorder. So whilst many people may be down that lower end of what might be considered normal dissociation, your more complex trauma is in that upper quadrant, and then dissociative identity disorder is right at the end there. So it can, have different aspects, different layers. And so we want to be able to identify if dissociation is present. And so what is dissociation? Well, the term was first therapeutically used by the French philosopher and psychologist Pierre Janet in the 1900s in reference to the fragmentation of the personality. And so how dissociation occurs? Well, infants, they begin life lacking in that capacity to regulate their biobehavioral state without the presence of the primary caregiver. So ideally, during that stage of development, the attuned caregiver co-regulates with the baby's dysregulated state. So that is what improves the child's capacity to self-soothe and be able to recover quickly themselves from dysregulation, but also experience positive emotional states and communicate through that social engagement system. So when that doesn't occur, often people will have what we call poor positive affect tolerance. Positive affect tolerance. So they might not be able to receive compliments. They might not be able to receive warmth from somebody. And so that is also something to consider when we're holding space for someone. If the capacity to be held isn't actually there in the first place, right? And so our ability to self-regulate and form an integrated sense of self later in life is dependent on these self-regulatory abilities that are acquired during that early stage of development. So without this co-regulation with their primary caregivers, small children are then dependent on the ability to alter their consciousness when soothing is needed and not available, and to be able to compartmentalize an overwhelming experience. So dissociation is actually a survival mechanism. So we also want to keep that in mind when we're working with medicine as well. And so there are lots of things that can maintain dissociation. So that inability to expand on their integrative capacity, that maintenance of the fragmentation. but also the necessity to relate to caregivers who are both dangerous and needed. You know, because unfortunately, as a child, your primary needs that need to be met are physiological. You need food in your belly, roof over your head, clothes on your back, and everything else is secondary to that. So we need to do what's needed in order to maintain that connection, which is often, aligning ourselves with the perpetrator. And so then what happens is we can get this conditioned phobic avoidance of the internal experience. Right. So that's very important when working with 5-MeO, because if somebody is phobic or unable to explore their internal world because that phobia has actually been part of their survival, then, that's something that we really need to be aware of, particularly in the psychedelic space in general, but I think particularly with 5-MeO. So we can understand dissociation through like 3 types of dissociation. So we've got primary, secondary, and tertiary. Now, can I share my screen? Do you know if I can? Oh, no.
You should be able to, yeah. Let me know if the share screen button doesn't work, but you should be able to, yeah.
No, I can't.
Yeah.
Go ahead and give that a shot now.
Cool. Can you guys see that?
Yes, yes.
Awesome. So this is just the model of structural dissociation of the personality. So the theory of structural dissociation is by Nienhuis, Van der Hart, and Steele. And it's a trauma model that characterizes people with complex trauma as having a division of the personality. So this can be described as having a range of different parts of the self. And we have 2 types of dissociative parts. So we have, I do like this name, the apparently normal part of the self. And that's the part that seeks to continue with day-to-day life in the most functional way possible and avoids remembering the traumatic events. So this part does not have access to the trauma memories. And then we have our emotional parts, which are the parts of the personality that are fixed in the moment of traumatization and are associated with the avoidance of the threatening stimuli. So with primary dissociation, as you can see, we have one trauma-containing part and one part that is without the trauma memory. So this is typically what you would see in PTSD, that is as diagnosed through the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders, or when there's a single incident trauma. Then we start to go up the spectrum a little bit more and we get to secondary dissociation. So this is, as you can see, we've got multiple trauma-containing parts, because as repeated trauma over a period of time happens, the person is required to find a way to contain more and more of that trauma material. And then we still have one part that remains functional without the trauma memories. So this is where we often see people with the diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress. And then finally, we get our tertiary dissociation down here, where we still have these multiple trauma-containing parts due to repeated traumas over a period of time. Then there's also multiple parts that remain functional without the trauma memories, and these may handle different aspects of the person's day-to-day life. And so this is typically where we see people with dissociative identity disorder. So that's just a model there of structural dissociation of the personality. So that is a very quick introduction to trauma and dissociation. And so I think it's important to have a bit of an understanding of some signs that dissociation may be present. So that could be things like poor recollection of childhood or poor memory in general. If I have someone that says to me their earliest memory is when they're 12 years old, that's quite a red flag for dissociation. And people will often dismiss this as, oh, I've just got a bad memory. or whatever. But most of us can probably remember from when we're about, at least 4 years old. So if there is a real lack of memory in childhood, then that's a pretty clear indicator of dissociation. And a previous history of seeking therapy. These people with dissociation tend to come into therapy, in the clinic I work at, where we all work with dissociative disorders, we're often the 12th, 13th, 14th therapist that the person has seen, and they will come in with a list of diagnoses as long as their arm, and they've done every A, B, C, D, E therapy that's available, but they often have had little progress or not much clarity on what's going on for them, or whether or not they've made any progress in their journey, those kinds of things. And then there's often a lot of somatic symptoms. So that can include things like a very high tolerance to pain. I have had people that didn't actually know that they broke a bone in their body because the disconnection from the felt sense is just so pronounced, right? And I'm not talking about a toe either. I'm talking about other limbs. And so even things like non-responsiveness to medications might be an indicator of dissociation. Things like stress-related headaches or other quite unexplainable somatic symptoms. So that's something to keep in mind. And then things like regressive behaviours. So that's postures or a tone of voice or body language that might be more reminiscent of what we would see in a young child. The difficulty making eye contact and really just heightened dysregulation, and are really lacking the ability to regulate themselves in any way. And then also lots of patterns of indecision or self-sabotage. So these people might really struggle to make everyday decisions, or they might have had multiple job changes. They might have tried to study 4 or 5 different things. There's usually an inability to commit to something. And they will often go between periods of being quite high functioning, but then periods of decompensation. And then there's usually patterns of some kind of self-destructive or addictive behaviour as well. So there are some screening tools that can help us to screen for dissociation. So things like the Adverse Childhood Events Scale, or the ACEs, which was the largest study looking at childhood abuse and neglect and the impact on later life, health and well-being. Then things like the Impact of Life Events Scale as well. For clinicians, there is the multidimensional inventory of dissociation, which is quite a comprehensive tool. And then screening tools like the Dissociative Experiences Scale can be quite helpful as well. And so it is important to screen and assess comprehensively for possible trauma, which has its challenges when there's those memory gaps, or when trauma is chronic and pervasive, as people may not be aware or even relate to their experience as being traumatic. Because if it's something you endured every day of your life, and if it was normal, it wasn't trauma, it was Saturday evening, right? And so simply asking someone point blank, do you have any trauma in your history, really isn't enough, because most people with complex trauma will probably say, no, I don't. The things that I've had to explain over the years as being considered traumatic, that has come an absolute shock to people and has been part of that difficult journey of coming to a realization of, life not being as they thought it was, or that what they did endure was trauma and not the norm. That can be in and of itself incredibly destabilizing. And then, things like racial trauma or systemic oppression, if that's, that is not just your experience, that's your parents' experience, that's your grandparents' experience, that intergenerational trauma as well, when it's really pass through the family line like that, people may not necessarily identify with their lived experience as being traumatic. The other thing you want to keep in mind is that trauma is not just what happened to you, it's what didn't happen to you. So we have to be able to see that implicit or read between the lines, because, we mostly think of trauma as, an assault or a disaster or an accident or something that happened to us. But if someone wasn't there to meet your needs, if someone wasn't there to believe you, if someone wasn't there to help you regulate yourself, that's not necessarily a traumatic incident, but it's the absence of a need being met or those unmet needs that are part of the trauma experience. So I often suggest to people that some helpful questions to ask are things like, what is your earliest memory? Or when you were a child, who did you go to for comfort or support? Because if someone says, if someone sits there for a moment and says, nobody, that's pretty telling, right? So, simply asking, is there trauma in your history is really not enough. We want to be a bit more comprehensive in how we assess for that kind of trauma. So that's a brief introduction to dissociation.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would you let us know, I'm sure people in the audience are curious, with dissociation, what is the risk if someone comes with dissociation and works with 5-MeO-DMT?
Yeah, so there are a number of risks, and I think particularly with 5-MeO, with the real ego dissolution and the rapid onset. So, I mean, for trauma, that might be okay to work with, and that's a might, all things considered, would be more of your simple PTSD, your primary dissociation or your adult onset trauma, where there is very limited dissociation present, but the person's also had the opportunity in their lifetime to develop a felt sense of safety with no significant attachment disruption, and able to develop a sense of self, because that's typically what's missing in that, especially tertiary dissociation. There isn't that integrative capacity or a well-developed sense of self. And so if you're going to dissolve the ego, you have to have a sense of self or an integrated sense of self to return to for safety and stability. So that's, one of the main dangers I would see if there hasn't been enough work done to really develop that first. And of course, anecdotally, we're seeing many stories of particularly combat veterans having really quite incredible experiences with 5-MeO. And I anticipate that would be more of that adult onset trauma, right? So with complex trauma or childhood trauma, I anticipate that you would really need, at minimum, significant prior work to increase what we call co-consciousness of parts. So you've got your grounded adult self that needs to have an awareness of the parts, but also parts in the system and awareness of each other and working collaboratively in that internal system. Because if you've got parts that hate each other or parts that aren't aware of each other, or a grounded adult that is phobic of their, more vulnerable parts, that's where we're going to get into trouble. And like I said, especially with this medicine, the rapid onset and the complete ego dissolution with moderate to threshold dose, if we don't have that stable sense of self to return to, we're at minimum going to exacerbate the fragmentation, and at worst, there could be serious consequences to having a very destabilized, fragmented person, whether that's psychosis or suicidality, particularly if there isn't those that capacity to self-regulate and ground. Because what we want to keep in mind as well when we're preparing someone is you're preparing the grounded adult that's present with you in the room. The internal system, those other parts may not be present there in the preparation. And so what happens when they participate in an experience they're not prepared for? That's the question. Yeah. So there's some of my, I guess, primary concerns in general that we want to be mindful of. Then there's some additional safety issues when it comes to like attachment trauma as well. So like I said before, during early life with the disruption of that attachment system with the primary caregiver, there isn't that opportunity to develop a felt sense of safety. And so, yeah, we want to be really focusing on developing safety in the body first, a capacity to be in the body more so, yeah, because it's very difficult to regulate if you can't be present with yourself, right?
Yeah.
Then typically when we're getting consent from someone, we're getting consent from the person in front of us. But when we're working with someone with dissociation and parts of the self, we actually have to make sure that whatever we do with that person, so in any therapy I do with anybody, that we're getting consent from all parts of the system. So in the past, I've done integration with people that have had a very difficult and destabilizing experience, only to recognize that dissociation was present and that there were likely very young, vulnerable parts to that person that didn't know what was happening, didn't know what was going on, and didn't actually consent to the process and were terrified. And so, that has to be considered in the preparation. And, whenever, even if I'm doing EMDR with someone, I've been preparing for that for some time, before starting, we drop in to ask, are all parts of you consenting to this? Or there's one therapist that says, is every cell in your body consenting to this? Because if the person says no, then we don't proceed, because we can't proceed until we have consent from all parts, right? So the other thing is that with attachment trauma, you're not just consenting to working with the medicine, you're consenting to the aftermath of working with the medicine. And so are they fully consenting to the fact that we don't know what's in Pandora's box? Because remember, these apparently normal parts of the self that are present, that are helping people with their day-to-day function, they don't have access to the trauma memory. These emotional parts, and some of which are often exiled, are the parts that are holding on to the trauma memories, because that's been their job over the years, is to hold on to that so that the person can continue to function, continue to participate in day-to-day life as best as they can. And so, again, I have to put that forward to the person of, I don't know what's in Pandora's box, if I'm doing EMDR with them. And you may connect with memories that you haven't connected with for a long time. And are you consenting to the fact that may happen? Do they have the time to deal with that if that may happen? Do they have the space? Do they have the safety to deal with that at home? Do they have the resources, both externally and internally, to be able to contend with that reality if they do connect to something they haven't connected with for a long time? For particularly cultural or ancestral trauma, if those themes emerge, is that support going to be available to them? Do they have the time and the space and the resources to continue with the unraveling of that realization? Because that's what ultimately happens. These parts hold on to memories, so we don't have to have a realization so that we can function. But when we have that realization, you can't unhave it. You have to continue working with it. And what often happens with the apparently normal part of the self, or the grounded adult, that's the part that goes, I'm ready for this. Let's do it. Let's get in there. Let's process all the memories. I am ready to heal, right? And we often, have to slow people down to say we actually have to work the pace of the slowest part. Everybody is part of this, and everybody's needs matter. And of course, we can understand that people want to get better. They want to do what's needed, and parts of them do have capacity to do that. But other parts, they're younger, they're less resourced, they need more time. So that's another thing to keep in consideration. And then, like I said before, dissociation usually involves the phobia of the internal experience and of the felt sense. So I often say people tend to exist from the neck up, right? There's not a lot of awareness of the body. So in sensory motor psychotherapy, we are gently titrating the awareness of or connection to the felt sense, and titration being a key word there. There's, I guess, lots of somatic therapies out there that work on the premise of titration. And because 5-MeO is very energetic and a very somatic experience, more so than a visual experience, the sudden connection to the body and the felt sense can throw someone with dissociation completely out of their window of tolerance. So the other thing is, with a threshold dose, we have just blasted through the protector parts a lot of the time. And protector parts are, such an integral part of the system. They have been the part that is keeping that person safe. And they're typically the part that you have to get on board first with orientating them to that person's present safety, the resources they have in the present, because their job is to fight tooth and nail to keep that person safe. So I really have a particular concern with this narrative of blasting through with 5-MeO. Like, if you don't kind of get there, wherever there is, straight away, that the solution is to blast through. And that is essentially, at minimum, disrespecting the protector parts, but destabilizing that internal system. Because you can imagine having those protector parts, blasted through, and when they gather themselves again, the consequence of that could be incredibly severe, because those defenses are there for a reason. Those protector parts are there for a reason. And we have to have the utmost respect for somebody's internal system. We want to get that integration happening, that integrative capacity and collaboration with all parts of the system. Like, you shouldn't have to blast through. That's my thoughts on that. And if you have to blast through, then we need to understand why that is the case, right? And so, that connection to the body is typically done in a gentle and titrated way to develop that felt sense of safety without the need of sending someone out of their window of tolerance. And so this is why some forms of meditation can be contraindicated with people with dissociation, because it can bring too much attention too quickly to the internal experience. Even something as simple as closing your eyes and going inwards may be unbearable for somebody with dissociation. And this is the same with breath work as well. I'm a big fan of somatic therapies. I do them myself. But when it comes to dissociation, we really need to be careful of this narrative of going inwards, because we have to develop a capacity to tolerate that and build that sense of safety that the person has not had an opportunity to build across the lifetime, right? So often meditation practices that would be useful often involve starting off a bit more externally. So eyes open, or focusing on things like posture and balance to start to bring a bit of awareness to the body, rather than closing the eyes, going inwards and cutting and connecting with that internal world. because that phobic avoidance has been part of the survival mechanism. The other problem with blasting through is that if the defenses are incredibly strong, there may be no response to the medicine. So I am aware of someone that had a threshold dose that was as cognizant as I am right now. So the problem with that, particularly with complex trauma, is that people, like I said before, they've done every A, B, C, D, E therapy. They've tried every medication. They've had 13, 14, 15, 20 therapists. They've been at this for 20 years, whatever. So they might try another psychedelic and it's not strong enough. And then you tend to make your way to the God molecule, right? So what happens when the God molecule doesn't work for you? Well, people tend to believe that, well, I'm just that broken and that unfixable. Nothing can help me. And so we're reinforcing, if we go straight to trying to blast through protectors without doing any of this work first, we're reinforcing that belief that that nothing will work for them, not even the God molecule will work for them. And that in itself comes with risk. So increased suicidality, things like that, which I've definitely seen before, because people just then believe that they're just that unfixable. They're that broken that nothing can help. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. And that's, something that is actually very, very, very common with participants, particularly with PTSD, is a fear that this will not work, that they are so broken that this will not work. And so if something is to happen that does reinforce that belief, it can be very, very offsetting to their process. And we've definitely seen quite a few participants, have that be their primary fear when they come to see us here at Tandava. And always something to approach very delicately. I had a question. So there's been this kind of narrative, and a lot of it due to kind of irresponsible journalism in a lot of ways. But there is a kind of idea that 5-MeO DMT cures PTSD, and so a lot of participants, that whether they reach out to us here at Tandava or are seeking out 5-MeO period or reach out through the 5 platform, are not really aware of the different ways that it can potentially harm them. So, this question, the answer of this would be for people in the audience who are potential seekers of 5-MeO DMT for trauma, as well as practitioners out there or soon to be practitioners who are looking to serve this medicine to be of service to people with trauma. When you're speaking about specific ways, specifically with disassociation, where 5-MeO might not be the best suitable medicine, can you name a few other kind of either whether it's specific cases or types of trauma that may really, I don't want to say contraindicate, but may not be the best fit for working with this medicine?
Well, when there's the other thing I think is when there's like a lot of attachment wounding in the person's history. So on the other side of this is in the event that the medicine session goes really well, and it's blissful and it's amazing, and they get to that place, they may have the vulnerability to idealize the facilitator, because another common feature of complex trauma, or especially attachment trauma, is people can go through periods of idealization of somebody, and then, completely dismiss them as well. And so if that facilitator is the first person to have ever listened to that person, or that the participant feels like they were the first person that truly saw them, or if that facilitator gave them that experience or provided this profound healing, then typically, again, it's the younger parts that hold on to the attachment wounds of previous experiences of abandonment and rejection. They might form an attachment to that facilitator. They might really struggled to identify the difference between, I guess, gratitude for having had an experience of being held, and perhaps crossing the line to infatuation or those kinds of things. And of course, if you have a very unethical facilitator, they can, I guess, really take advantage of that as well. And so if the person hasn't worked through some of those prior wounds related to abandonment and rejection, particularly if, let's say it's a facilitator who, has a capped number of sessions, or maybe it's a facilitator that has disclosed, like, look, I don't do the integration, I refer you on for integration. My role is purely one of facilitation. If the person forms an attachment to that facilitator because they've seen them as giving them this profound healing experience, they have, they're starting to form an infatuation or whatever, then when that facilitator no longer has contact because the retreat's over or they're handed on for integration, whatever, we could actually be reinforcing or reenacting an abandonment wound there as well. So with the profundity of this medicine, I think that's where there is another risk as well, where there is more of that attachment and desire for connection with the vulnerability of younger parts. So yeah, other than dissociation, I think that's one to keep in mind as well, to just, and I think there are ways you can mitigate that. So my thoughts are, when you're preparing somebody, it would be a good idea to include whoever is going to be the integration therapist in the preparation, even if they can't participate in the actual medicine session itself, because that way you're starting to form a connection. They're getting an understanding of that person's experience. They're part of the team already. So when the facilitator perhaps no longer is present, there is a buffer to that as well. So I guess I have seen that before, where people have been referred to an integration specialist that wasn't involved in any of the preparation, even if it's just one session or something. And it's often met with, like, I don't know this person, they don't know what I just went through. How can they understand that? I can't believe I had this amazing experience and I don't get to continue the connection with that facilitator. Like, that in itself can be quite an abandonment injury for the person. So that's another one I'd keep in mind. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a question from our dear friend, Mr. Merrill Ward. And he says, it is important to manage expectations of individuals approaching this work. Certain individuals have responded very well to 5-MeO-DMT for PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Even this material is generally based on anecdotal reporting surveys. Can you speak to the phenomena where this sacrament has really helped individuals who have struggled with these issues, where standard forms of therapy have not helped them?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, there has been many reports of people, experiencing profound benefits from working with this medicine. And, I guess I'm more curious about the circumstances in which that person has been able to have such a profound experience. What kind of work have they done prior? How was the container set up? Who was present? What kind of space did they create for themselves to allow for that process to unravel? Did they sit with the medicine on Saturday and then go to work on Monday? Or did they create time in their life to really allow for that that early stage of integration to occur. So, 5-MeO is a tool in the toolkit, and I tend to look more broadly at the cycle, the spiritual, the environmental, the emotional, the psychological, and the physical. And 5-MeO being a tool in that. Because I guess I'm mindful of this language of 5-MeO healed my trauma. It's like, actually, no, it didn't. You healed your trauma by utilizing various tools in the toolkit to help you access that inner wisdom, that innate, or come back to that remembering of what's there. So, I really want to emphasize the point of empowering the person to recognize their role in that. But that's not to dismiss that these tools are incredibly useful for many people. And I guess the benefit of these tools as well is they can often get people somewhere quicker than, say, other forms of therapy. So how many times have we heard that, that medicine session was equivalent to 10 years of therapy? That can be the case. So, if we are just really cautious and think broadly in the preparation and management of safety, then of course it can be a useful tool in working through post-traumatic stress. But it's a tool in the toolkit. It can't be the only tool. I wholeheartedly believe that.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's a really, really, really important point to make, is that 5-MeO DMT is a tool. And yes, it can be highly advantaged to someone resolving trauma within their process. However, just as you said, the container really, really, really matters. And it makes the difference of whether this work ends up benefiting the participant or ends up harming them. We've been doing a series of case studies from around the world of different participants who have had difficulty or challenges during their integration period. And, one of the common threads we found was when there was a lack of a container, both a lack of preparation, hands-on preparation beforehand, not just a phone call, but real, good preparation work, as well as integration support. We'd had plenty of people who had a beautiful, blissful, amazing experience on the medicine, but then weeks later, their life is falling apart because trauma has resurfaced or something else is going on that they don't have the tools to work through. And so 5-MeO DMT is such a powerful tool, but it needs tools to support it, the process.
Yeah, because the other thing with trauma, just on this, having the blissful experience, is that for people with trauma, often it's the pleasant emotional states that are the trigger, not the unpleasant. Because if I wholeheartedly believe that I'm worthless, or that I don't deserve anything, or that, feeling good is shameful, or maybe something happened to me where feeling good was the precursor to something terrible happening, then actually experiencing something pleasant can be the challenge or really destabilizing. So the integration and being held in that has to happen, very quickly. That it can't be like, I'll check in with you in 2 weeks' time, or things that I've heard in the past. And, things like container, trauma informed, and integration are real buzzwords at the moment. And I can feel my nervous system increasing right now, because this is my real bugbear. Because what does that even mean? Just because you use the word container and integration on your website, it doesn't mean you're providing it. So whenever someone is looking for a facilitator, I do ask them to question the facilitator. What do they mean by container? What do they mean by trauma form? When does this connection or this container start? And most importantly, when does it end? And what happens if the number of prescribed integration sessions are not adequate for me? And is that, like I said, is the integration therapist included in the preparation? Like, will they learn about me? Will they learn about that experience? Will they kind of be going on this journey with me, And again, so that trust can start to build, and we can kind of buffer any potential for an attachment disruption if the facilitator isn't the one considering the integration, continuing with the integration. So yeah, like container integration, people need to really ask prospective facilitators what that means to them, because there's a lot of people out there, not just in the medicine world, but I do a lot of integration for people that are what I call breathwork casualties, that have gone to giant breathwork circles of, 50 plus people doing holotropic styles when there's only 4 facilitators, and those facilitators not actually knowing what to do to support the person, but also being spread far too thin. You can't have 4 facilitators for 50 people, right? So, yeah, but on the nice flyer, it will say things like, we create a safe container. And so, yeah, that's my real bugbear at the moment.
Yes, we can relate. we also have similar gripes. So we've got another question from Rachel. And Rachel says, life seems to have an inherent quality of challenge, loss, disappointment, loneliness, maybe even violence. How do you differentiate between this and trauma? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, because, I think the word trauma can be misused from time to time. And that, yeah, life does have challenging experiences in it. That doesn't necessarily make it traumatic as such. Because remember, well, this is where I really like Gabor Mate's stuff. It's like trauma is not necessarily what happened to you. It's what you had to deal with on your own and what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. So there are people that can experience really traumatic events, but they don't go on to develop post-traumatic stress because there was people that supported them. There was people that believed them. They had developed they knew what safety felt like, so they knew how to return to safety. Like there's so many of those things that mean that just because you've experienced life's challenges or a traumatic incident, it doesn't mean that you'll go on to develop post-traumatic stress. So we're really looking at how that is impacting the person. So that could be things like classic symptoms like nightmares, but it can be things like just checking out how regulated that person's nervous system is. Do they have capacity to regulate themselves? Can they weather life's challenges, or are they lacking the resources to be able to do that? Because on the other side, there may be things that a well-resourced person can experience and go, oh, that doesn't constitute trauma. But for somebody without resources, internally and externally, it can certainly be traumatic. And so I have this a lot in my work, where people really undermine their experience and say, well, it can't be traumatic because, what happened to that other person was far worse. And it's like, well, objectively, that might be true, but they might have had both internal and external resources to be able to work through that and integrate that experience so that they didn't go on to develop post-traumatic stress. So I think that's, important to understand. It's not so much about the incident itself, but how resourced the person is or was to be able to weather that and integrate it into their experience. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
So something that I'd love to hear you speak about is, this medicine can traumatize people, and it can re-traumatize people who already had trauma. Can you speak to your knowledge around this?
Yeah, I guess, again, the rapid onset and the real ego dissolution, that's an experience that really requires a lot of preparation. And if there's parts of you that are really resisting the letting go, the allowing, then that's when we can see it become a really terrifying and traumatic experience for people. And, it may be even just another time in their life where something, you know, overrid their desire to stop or to not go there, those kinds of things. So yeah, that can be really traumatic and re-traumatizing if there has been experiences that were non-consensual in particular, because like I said, the grounded adult might consent, but other parts of the system may not be consenting to that. And so when it is a really traumatic experience, obviously we can, again, buffer the consequence of that with really good, robust integration. And that's the difference between, say, a bad trip and a difficult trip, right? And, you know, certainly that's going to be quite challenging if there is that real dissociation and fragmentation of the self, which is why I would be very cautious about considering doing a threshold dose if that is present, because, you know, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, this hasn't been researched, and I actually, you know, don't know a lot of anecdotes of people with dissociation or the real secondary and tertiary dissociation working with 5-MeO. So this is uncharted territory, but from what I understand of 5-MeO and what I understand of dissociation, yeah, when that internal system experiences that degree of, I guess, becoming immobilized from doing their job in the system, you know, I think the integration process of that would be at best very long term, but I think there would be significant consequences for that person, you know, whether it's a psychosis, whether it's even just really exacerbating the sense of having a lack of safety in the world. You know, we don't want people to come out of these experiences worse than when they went in. And I guess that does happen in the psychedelic realms. And part of me is curious about whether that can be explained through not necessarily undiagnosed, but unrecognized dissociative features in that person.
Thank you. All right, we've got some other good questions coming up. And first one I'll just speak to real quick. And we have someone asking, if someone has had a 5-MeO experience and is having trouble integrating it, where can they turn for integration support? Well, we have integration resources on the 5 platform, and we have a directory of integration specialists that are all experienced with the 5-MeO DMT process, so you can read the profiles. And I am going to type a link right to the page right there. And so there is that. Dr. Bianca, can you share any differences in approach when dealing with interpersonal and systemic trauma?
Well, you know, I don't know that I can really be an authority to speak to that, but I guess what I would say is to work collaboratively with people that can provide support when there is systemic trauma or racial trauma, those kinds of things involved. You know, in the psychology realm, or at least in the circles I walk in, we work in multidisciplinary ways. I work a lot with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and in this company that I am part of that's developing a model of culturally safe therapy, I'm the only non-Indigenous person that's part of that. I have always worked alongside an Indigenous person that was an appropriate person to be working with. And I guess when it comes to medicine facilitators, I would encourage them to do the same, because we can't be the jack of all trades, you know, and no one is expecting you to, but work in a multidisciplinary team, you know, work with people that can provide cultural support and culturally safe forms of therapy that understand the experience of systemic and racial trauma and oppression, work with people that understand trauma, work with people that understand the psychopharmacology of these medicines. Like, don't be a hero. You don't have to do it all yourself. No one is expecting you to do that. have the humility and the wisdom to work collaboratively in a team of people that, you know, bring their wealth of knowledge and their experience to the table. And I think that's particularly relevant when we're working with Indigenous peoples worldwide. And in Australia, obviously, my experience being with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, you know, I've always worked alongside somebody that has that cultural knowledge.
Beautiful. Thank you. All right. And from Francesca, good question. Do you think there is any correlation between dissociative tendencies and the whiteout experiences with 5-MeO?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know. I do not know the answer to that question, because there's obviously people that without dissociation that have certainly gotten that whiteout, whether they wanted it or not. So yeah. And, you know, I'm curious as to whether, you know, I actually wonder if there might be the potential to white out less, or actually need a higher dose to white out. Like I said, if you've got these protector parts that are working really, really hard. And like I said, I am aware of someone that was as cognizant as I am now on a very, very high dose. And so, yeah, who knows? That's an interesting question.
Yes. Thank you. All right. And last question we have up here from Colette. Many people who are not feeling very stable in life, i.e. no money in the bank, no support system, no job or friends, and almost always a deep trauma history, or present in their day-to-day reality, then they believe having a psychedelic experience will help them. What are your thoughts around caution around these type of situations? Yeah,
I think that's a great question, because it is really common, and it's common not just in psychedelic medicines. It's common for people with trauma seeking treatment in any way. And I think there is a big risk of going into plant medicine experience without having any community there to hold you in the aftermath. And so my thoughts on that is, first thing, support the person to cultivate a community. You know, many people, sadly, the people that are supposed to be closest to them are the people that have caused them the most harm. So there isn't family, there may not be friends, those kinds of things. So I would definitely be explaining the rationale or the reason why we want to plug that person in to community first and foremost. And yes, that is complicated when there is these attachment wounding, because the thing that we need most, connection, is the thing that we're most fearful of. So how do we navigate that? I don't necessarily think the answer to that is to go and have a psychedelic experience, because whilst you're in the journey, you'll probably be okay, maybe. But then what happens afterwards? Where do you go? Who do you connect with? Who do you tell about this life-changing experience you've had? Or do you just go and sit on your couch and wonder what to do with all of this? So yeah, I think it's so important to look more broadly and holistically at, you know, community, environment, those kinds of things, and cultivate the safety net first before going into these experiences. And, you know, that might be integration circles. It might be your local psychedelic society. It might be a community center. It may not be friends. It may not be family, but we can think and, you know, be more broad, think more broadly than that anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. We've got a couple more questions floating in that I'm going to hit you with. All right. So, hello, this is a great webinar for someone who's used 5-MeO and various other psychedelics and overcome PTSD and CPTSD, anxiety, depression, etc., and had great experiences. However, still seems to be stuck in those old habits, minus the anxiety and depression. still not venturing back out into the world and almost acting like a kid hiding at home, even though in a much better place. Still need more or deeper experience, or where to go from there? Thanks.
Yeah. Wow, that's a great question. And thank you for sharing your experience, whoever that was. And I think that is an important point, that the medicine is often, it's like a magnifying glass. It shows us what we need to look at, but what we do afterwards is so important in terms of that integration process. So whilst the experience, might have been really beautiful or blissful, and maybe there is some relief from some of those depression or anxiety symptoms, like I said, there are other parts of the internal system that need to integrate that experience in their way as well, right? So different parts would have different integration needs, because they will also see the experience or the trauma experience through a different lens. Some parts might be really angry and full of hatred. Some parts might actually be still wanting connection with a perpetrator, so then there's this real conflict in the internal system of, I know that was terrible and I'm angry it happened, but part of me still misses that and wants that connection, because some connection is better than no connection. That's just an example. So the integration process, when trauma is complex, is also complex, because there's different parts of the system that require integration support. So I guess in terms of where to go from there, if you're not seeing somebody already for ongoing integration support, I guess I'd really encourage you to do that. And somebody that perhaps is familiar with the concept of parts of the self. There's lots of different perspectives on that, whether it's structural dissociation, whether it's internal family systems, whether it's ego state, whether it's depth psychology or transpersonal psychology. There's people that just can understand this concept of multiplicity of the self. Would probably be really good to hook up with an integration therapist to continue that journey.
Yeah, thank you. And that actually just kind of leads right into another question that I can kind of speak to a bit here. One person is saying, many express desire but fear to using the medicine. Many more suggest just doing it. The increasing amount of post-integration sounds amazing. Is there a need for greater pre-integration/prep? And what would that look like? Yes, there definitely is a great need for pre-integration and preparation. We've seen a direct correlation between overpowering and extreme reactivations and a lack of preparation. We've also seen a direct correlation between a lack of preparation and extremely challenging experiences, challenging integrations, and other adverse effects. And what it looks like is unique to each container, unique to each participant and practitioner. I'm going to, again, post a link to the site, to the 5 platform, where there's a lot of really good information about that. And was there anything that you wanted to add to that, Bianca?
Well, yeah, just that preparation. I think just being mindful of, it's got to include all parts of the person. If you are just preparing the grounded adult part, and there is other, this aspect of multiplicity and other parts of the system uninvolved in a preparation process, well, they're not consenting, they're not prepared, they don't have the skills, right? And so I guess, again, I'm not quite sure 5-MeO is appropriate for the reasons I've discussed, but, there will be people that have done a lot of therapy, perhaps arts work therapy, that do have co-consciousness and more collaboration with their internal system. And so if they are choosing to go and work with a medicine, and they've decided that's what they want to do, then that would need to be considered, I guess, in the preparation process, is to make sure all parts of them are involved in that preparation.
Mhm. All right. And the last two questions, and this one, none of us can really answer directly because it is going to be very unique to particular cases. But Bianca, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure we'll add something on too. How would I determine if I am ready for an experience like this? I tried traditional mental health with disastrous outcomes. I've struggled with psychedelics, MDMA, psilocybin at 7 grams, very severely, but seems to have made progress. Daily life is extremely difficult, but I'm looking for healing. Who determines the line?
Big question. Yeah. One thing I want to point out is healing from trauma is a journey, and it's often a slow journey, and it takes time, and that's really hard to I guess how to manage that when there is that desire for healing and to be well and to be functioning well, those kinds of things. And I often say to people, look, you didn't get here in a year to the place you are in a year. We're probably not going to unravel it in a year either. And particularly when complex trauma and dissociation is present, the gains can be quite subtle. We're not going to go from A to B in our healing journey really quickly. It is this chipping away and peeling back those onion layers, and it does take time. Reprogramming a nervous system that has been wired for survival for decades takes time, and that's the reality of healing or working with trauma, is that no one experience is likely going to heal your trauma, but it's going to be this chipping away, this peeling back layers of layers on this journey that may take, an extended period of time. I mean, who's going to put their hand up and say, oh, I'm healed, because that I'm not putting my hand up to say that. It's this journey that we're on, right? And for the many of us for the rest of our lives, in terms of chipping away and becoming more able to regulate our nervous systems and cultivate safety, live authentically, those kinds of things. So yeah, obviously not knowing this individual's person, circumstances or situation, I just want to put it out there that this work is slow work, because we are part of nature and the natural world, and everything that happens in nature is slow, right? And we're part of that. So slow it down.
Thank you. The only thing I would add would be, how do you know if you're ready for something like this? Is your life in a stable place at the moment? Is your living situation in a stable place? Are you in a place to where you have stability to completely unfold? Sometimes to address our deepest wounds and our deepest traumas, we have to completely unfold. And that takes a very stable and secure container. So ensuring that you have the support system to be able to deal with whatever comes up. And for people who are working through trauma or working through significant things with 5-MeO, a one-off, one-day ceremony generally is not the best way to go about things. Usually a multi-day container whether it's a retreat or whether you're with a practitioner for a few days, and there needs to be preparation and integration. That is such a vital part of the whole equation. It's extremely important. And so making sure that you're in a place to where you can safely unfold, to where you have the stability and the openness to be able to really dive in there, but also make sure the container that you're about to get into has the walls to hold you and has the strength to hold you. Anything else to add there?
That's beautiful.
All right. And last question, from a developmental psychology perspective, have you seen this medicine help with people who have had developmental challenges?
Yeah, so look, I haven't, and that's just because it hasn't come on my radar as such. Only when there has been a need for integration after a very difficult experience. So yeah, and this hasn't been researched yet either. I guess people with dissociation are typically not included in research, and with developmental trauma we may see elements of dissociation. So yeah, it hasn't come across my radar, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are people that have had experiences with 5-MeO and that developmental trauma, because I've certainly heard about it with other psychedelics, but not necessarily 5-MeO. And I guess one of the reasons I would say that is, with 5-MeO, there's not a lot of there's not really content that comes up in the experience like there is, say, with psilocybin, where people can report back things like, I relived my birth trauma, like I relived what it was like to, be separated from my mum, or those kinds of things, or they can recount the content of an experience. Whereas with 5-MeO, that's not the case. It's energetic. It's more of a somatic experience. There's not typically a lot of content. So that's probably why it hasn't come across my radar. But there may be people and integration therapists out there that have, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bianca.
Thank you, Bianca.
That was wonderful. We appreciate having you on here. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Please stay tuned. We're going to be announcing our next month's speaker in the next few days. And what do we want to announce?
Nothing.
I don't know if we have much announcements tonight, but sending lots of love to all of you. And again, Bianca, thank you so much. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Yes.
At the Tandava
I'll see you very soon. We can't wait to be back.
Looking forward to having you back. Awesome, everyone. Have a beautiful evening. Take care, everybody. Ciao.